The whole purpose of today is really to sort of cover the foundations of resumes. You're all doing a great job of integrating sort of your experience into these documents. There is no one way of doing it. I'm going to provide some foundational information and advice that you can leverage as you're putting together your resume. These are things that are easy to do, that are helpful, but there is no one way to do it, right? So mine are just suggestions that you can incorporate. So let's think about the idea of creating a resume. And I think, I often start off with this diagram, our iceberg diagram, in that oftentimes people sit down and they start writing a resume first because they know they have to do that. But the actual resume writing part, the putting down on a piece of paper or typing it out, whatever it is, it's really the smallest part of the process. It's the thing that you try to do or should try to do right at the end of doing lots of other things. Because what a truly effective resume is built on is your knowledge of the field that you're going into. So in this case, your knowledge of the consulting world. What is valued in the world of consulting? What skills are highlighted? What language is used to describe those skills in action? What are the outcomes that are valued in different types of consulting? Knowing that consulting is a broad field and there are lots of niche types of roles within, or organizations within that with different focus areas, what are some of the skills that really truly jump out from a resume that they're looking for? That comes from your research into the field. That comes from you chatting with people. That comes from you understanding the nature of the role by seeing it through the lived experience of people who already have consulting roles, right? And so if you do all of this, if you spend your time doing research into the field and being involved in PPG and getting your own hands on those experiences and speaking with people, when it actually comes to writing the resume, you'll feel much more confident about putting together a really nice, effective narrative about your skills. So what does that mean? Well, take advantage of the resources that are available. You're in PPG, so that's fantastic, or you're associated with PPG, so you're already doing this. On our website, you'll see our Vault guides covering sort of consulting. In this case, these ones cover some of the consulting fields. What is it? What are the jobs? Who are the top firms? You can get to know them through these experiences. You can get to know them through information sessions that they're putting on virtually, sometimes on campus. You get to know them by chatting with them at career fairs. This is all information that you can gather to make your understanding of consulting much more robust as you're putting together your own narrative. You also want to be leveraging the network, right? So one of the great aspects of the LinkedIn platform in terms of the alumni tool is that you can narrow down the 200,000 alumni by the field consulting. So you get about 6,000 or 7,000 Penn alumni and current students who are engaged in a consulting type role, and then you can find people that sort of connect, with your background or in organizations that you are interested in, and you can find your first degree connections, and you can find your second degree connections, and you can have some of these conversations with people, right, and learn more about those types of roles. So a wonderful way to make sure that you are getting information that you need. And we're not talking about networking today, but it is a key part of this whole process. And when you are networking with people, the questions that you ask are really important. They're important in terms of how you or what you are able to extract from those conversations. So the questions I would sort of recommend asking are the ones sort of, that I've highlighted here. They're actionable questions, because you ask someone, what are the skills that you rely on to be successful? Whatever they say next and however they say it, that is the type of language that you want to integrate into your narrative, whether that's in a resume, a cover letter, an interview answer. But it gives you real world insight into what are the things that you've done that you can talk about that are really going to resonate with someone in the consulting realm. The same with the challenges, right? So a big aspect of consulting is demonstrating problem-solving skills, demonstrating how you've overcome, solved challenges creatively and innovatively to make change. And so asking people, what are the challenges that you face? And then thinking about, well, where have I faced similar challenges? And how can I demonstrate that in my narrative that I'm putting together? So if you ask these types of questions to people, you will have information that you can use directly in your application materials and in your interview answers. So these are really great questions to sort of be able to focus on. Now, the interesting thing about consulting is that there are job descriptions, but they're not very detailed, right? Because the whole nature of consulting is that it's a very broad realm that values experience from different backgrounds, whether you're a PhD in the humanities or a master's student or a PhD in STEM fields or a postdoc, it doesn't really matter, right? You can leverage different aspects of your experience. And so these are all sort of bullet points that I pulled from multiple job postings that were related to the consulting field, some in the life sciences, some just general management and strategy consulting. But as you can see, they're very sort of nebulous. They're very intangibles. But they're also, that's what they are looking for. That's how you are trying to present yourself in addition to your strong quantitative skills and your collaborative mindset and your ability to communicate effectively. These are, some of the tangible things that should pop out from some of your materials as you're putting those together. Now, as I look at these, the ones that really stand out as being uniquely consulting in certain cases are sort of these three here, right? So at the heart of consulting, it's you taking complex information, boiling it down, identifying how you can find patterns in that information or solutions to the challenges that exist within that information, and then communicating clear recommendations for action that someone wants to implement, or if they don't want to implement, that they realize that they have to implement, right? So taking lots of complex stuff, boiling it down into key recommendations, and then convincing someone to enact those recommendations. At the heart of it, in many cases, that's what consulting is. And so these are things that really should stand out from some of your narratives as you're creating that, right? What change have you made through your research, through the work in your department, through your leadership experiences, through your projects at PPG, right? What have you been able to change by going through this process? And if you can articulate some of those experiences in your resume, I think you're doing a great job of really making that, these skill sets come to life. Now, you can't just take the sort of those broad concepts and repeat them in your resume without some context, right? If they look for strong communication skills, you can't just say, oh, yes, I use strong communication skills as a graduate student, right? You're going to have to find some context to sort of hang those skills on. And one of the ideas about a resume is that after reading your bullet points as you're describing your experience, I should be able to picture pretty clearly what that looks like, or how I should be able to picture you using those skills in action to achieve your outcomes, right? So the imagery in my head needs to be rich, and it needs to be rich because the way that you've described those skills in action makes it rich and makes it memorable and makes it engaging. And so generic statements that are too broad sort of evaporate very quickly as I'm reading them because I can't really picture what's going on. The image is sort of all blurry. Too specific takes me into the wrong realm. Now you're talking about a scientific experiment that you did, and it's all about the experiment, not about the skills that you used to do it. So between that is that sort of sweet spot where you're demonstrating transferable skills and using enough language to make it make sense and memorable without sort of going one way or the other to the extremes. So the general structure for the bullet points that you're writing, and this applies to every resume, not just a consulting one, is basically skill, context, outcome, right? So every bullet point should have a skill that you are selling. You're marketing this skill, and that skill should be relevant to your reader, in this case, our hiring manager in a consulting firm. So a transferable relevant skill is the sort of the foundation. So the words that come right after the bullet point, that's the skill that you're marketing. So you have to be careful which words you use there because you're drawing attention to those things. The context is how you did that. For many of you, that's going to be research that you've done. For some of you, it's going to be PPG projects that you can talk about. For other things, it might be leadership experiences that you have, right? The context doesn't have to be related to the nature of the consulting role necessarily, but it has to make the skill make sense. And then the outcome demonstrates how effective the skill is. So if you say that you led a team of 5 people, that's great, but it doesn't tell me if that leadership skill is effective. But if you say you led a team of 5 people and came first in a case competition, the first place in the case competition shows me that your leadership skills in this story are effective because you're connecting the outcome with the skill. So skill, context, outcome is a really great way to make sure that you have a full narrative in your bullet points as you're writing a resume. And not everything will have an outcome that feels tangible, and certainly not an outcome that's necessarily quantifiable. It's not necessarily a number, a 30% increase in happiness in the lab because you did something, right? Sometimes it becomes too forced if you try to quantify everything, but reflect on whether there is an outcome that you can identify. Now, these are examples of sort of bullet points that I often see in resumes that don't sort of take you anywhere in terms of the story, right? These are sort of broad level, short bullet points. And pretty much any time that you have half a line of a bullet point, 6 to 8 words of a bullet point, you're not going to be telling a rich enough story, I think, to sort of help people see the sort of the robustness of that experience. But if you try to imagine any of these experiences in your head, right, you don't necessarily know what's going on, and it becomes fairly hard to say, what does this skill look like? How is that helpful in this context? So avoiding the broad is going to be helpful as part of this process to make sure that you are creating clear imagery for people. A good example of things I see a lot in resumes, especially for at the PhD and postdoc level, is sort of people being TAs, especially, right? And graded exams and held office hours are just two great examples of describing a role just purely based on what you did, not how valuable it is, or not what skills you use. Because grading exams and holding office hours are not things that you bring with you to a consulting role. You won't be doing those things. But there are skills that are transferable. Now, the reason I have this picture of an empty classroom here is because I've held office hours where no one has come at all. I've sat in an empty room for 2 hours and wish I wasn't there. And that's what I think about sometimes when I read held office hours. You know, I picture me in this empty room thinking, I'm not using my skills effectively here. So that's obviously not what you meant or this person meant, but that's how I read it in, because there's not enough context to keep me focused on what the skill actually is, right? You're giving me the flexibility to interpret this through my lived experience, and my lived experience is holding office hours was a waste of my 2 hours. There are better ways of describing the things here, right? You don't want to describe them in the context of being a TA. You want to describe them in the context of skills that are applicable. You use your knowledge to do something. You use extensive knowledge of science or engineering to communicate this. You manage multiple projects and deadlines across a course with 300 students, and you have to sort of grapple this. You liaised effectively with faculty and other TAs to do this. You're collaborative in your work, right? These are all things that you did as a TA. This is not language that you typically use in academia to describe it, but they're all accurate in different ways. And that's the nature of translating some of these experiences, right? You really want to make sure that you're not just saying, I did this. You really want to make sure you say, oh, this is how what I did, right? These are the skills that I used to do this, and this is how they're relevant to the role. So again, these are just different examples: holding office hours, using knowledge, working one-on-one. Can you say that it contributed to 90% of the class getting A grades? Well, you were part of that process. So, I mean, you have to be accurate and you have to be authentic in the way that you're describing it, but you also can sort of think about what are the data there to support that. Grading papers, it's all about feedback. It's providing real-time feedback. It's using information to do that, right? These are all things that you can leverage as you are sort of describing these experiences. And I'm not saying that being a TA is the thing that you really want to bring to the forefront of your resume, but if it's there and you want to talk about it, you really want to make sure that it pops out as being transferable. Things to avoid in resume are words that don't create nice pictures, right? So assisting with a thing or participating in a thing. These aren't strong words because it's easy to participate in an event. You just have to be present to a certain extent. The thing you want to talk about is how you assisted and in what way you participated. Those are the skills that you really want to bring to the forefront. And the words assisted and participated often get in the way of those stronger words. Worked is another one, right? So if you say to me, what are you doing tomorrow? And I say, I'm working. It doesn't create an image. What does that mean? It doesn't sound fun at all, right? But if you can demonstrate what it is that you're doing when you're working, that's going to be a much more impactful way of describing it. So just be aware of the language and make sure that it is dynamic and actionable in terms of how it comes across. So rather than assisting in project research, you just talk about the research, right? Probably in many cases, the role that you have is a research assistant anyway. And so it's in the job title that you're an assistant and you're assisting. You can talk more about what it is you actually did as a research assistant to communicate the value there. Participating in conferences, going to conferences, right? That can be a skill. It can be a skill if you can network with people. If you've gained knowledge of industry trends, you can talk about that. But just saying that you attended conferences doesn't mean that you left the hotel room or spoke to anyone, right? But you can make that come alive if that's what you actually did, and if that's a skill set that you really want to bring to the forefront. The other aspect of the resume is that you always want to ask yourself two things as you're going through. You want to ask yourself, what are the takeaways that I want a reader to have, having read any of the bullet points that I've written, right? So you look at a bullet point and you say, what do I want the reader to walk away with having read this? And make sure that you can articulate what that is. Because if you don't know what the takeaway is, then the reader's probably going to have less of an idea because they haven't lived your experience. Then if you look at your resume as a whole, you can ask yourself, well, what are the main conclusions of this? If I had to conclude this in 3 concluding points, what would they be? What would I want the reader to sort of walk away with having read the whole resume together? One of the questions that someone had about resumes is, do I need a summary section that sits on top? And it's a good question because oftentimes if you're going for a one-page version of your resume, it's already a summary, right? You've had to condense a lot to get it onto one page. And so sticking another summary on top is really hard because there's not much space and you're already summarizing. But these thematic conclusions can sometimes really help the reader picture what your core skills are, right? Otherwise, they have to read through the resume and then make up their own mind what your takeaways are. But if you start off with, these are my takeaways, these are the things I want you to know, it's then sometimes easier for the reader to see those things come to light, right? And this is not one person here, right? These are just 5 separate conclusionary statements drawn from different resumes. So it's like, that's a lot of stuff that this person's doing. These are just examples of the themes that you might touch on to sort of bias the reader's perspective towards seeing this information come to life in your resume. So do you need a summary section? No. If you have one, it's a great way of pulling together themes and trends from your experience to coalesce them into sort of a core set of conclusions that you want someone to walk away with. So I sort of share this as an example of what that can look like. Formatting is a great matter on people's mind when it comes to resume. People say, is there a template I should use? And there's a million and one templates, but there's nothing magical about templates, right? It doesn't really matter what it looks like, because your goal in formatting a resume is actually for no one to ever notice the formatting, right? You never want someone to say, that's a beautiful set of bullet points you have here, right? Because that's not important. That's not what you want to get across. It's the content that matters. And so you spend a lot of time on the formatting so that no one ever notices it. That's your goal, right? You want the content to speak for itself. So saying, I have a few thoughts on what you can sort of do to make this easier, right? Because with the formatting, you want to guide the reader through your narrative in a cohesive way, prioritizing the key information and ensuring that you don't have any errors that make it easy for someone to say, this doesn't look good, right? This is uneven, there's punctuation mistakes or whatever it is. You don't want to be sort of kicked out of a process because there are sort of errors in your document. So the formatting is there to ensure that people can see the content and engage with it in a structured way, and to ensure that you don't have errors that are easy for people to pick on arbitrarily and say, this person doesn't have good attention to detail. People like oftentimes the 2-column approach to resumes because it makes it look more interesting, but I would recommend a single column approach. And the reason I say that is because when you give me 2 columns, you no longer can control how I'm reading through your resume, right? I can just look at the left-hand column and totally ignore the right-hand side because I make my mind up from the left-hand side. I can read your summary and then skip to the right-hand side because it says relevant here. Now I'm reading the right-hand side and I'm ignoring the left. Right, once you lose control of how I'm going through the resume, you lose control of the narrative that you're creating and how you want someone to sort of process your experience. And so even though a 1-page version looks and feels boring, that's okay, because it's the content that tells your story, not the overall structure. So you start off with, if you have a summary, the summary, you're mostly going to start off with your education, unless you're a postdoc, in which you can start off with your sort of relevant experience, postdoc being at the top of that. So summary, education, relevant experience, which brings together different aspects of your background and skills, probably leadership experience for consulting firms will be thrown in there. That's really all you need. And the way that looks and the style of those sections, it's yours to decide. You can pull from different templates, but be thoughtful about how you're prioritizing information as part of that. And I'll give you some examples of how I think that can look as we go through this. Those conclusions that we talked about, that summary section, those are great to have, as we talked about, but they have to be supported by evidence in the main part of the resume, right? So if you say you're an effective leader at the top, but there's no evidence of leadership in the rest of the body of the resume, then it becomes less believable. So just like with a scientific paper or other types of research papers, the conclusions at the end are supported by evidence in the main part. Here, the conclusions at the beginning need to be supported by information that's in the rest of the body of the resume. Skills are great. I mean, there are fewer skills needed in consulting than in some areas of research. You can certainly mention some of those key quantitative skills, programming skills, and other things. But again, listing them at the bottom of the skill section is great. Showing them in action where they are relevant in the main body of the resume is also going to be another way to make those come to life in the mind of the reader. Okay, let's walk through some of the different sections just so you have a sense of this. Obviously, your name is the first thing. It can be big, just to make it stand out. If you have your PhD already or the degrees, you can stick those after your name. These days, you don't need a street address. You just need city and state in most cases, because no one's going to write to you, and you don't want to give people your address when you don't need to do that. So phone, email, city, state. But you don't need the word phone, and you don't need the word email. You just actually need the address and the phone. Everyone knows what it is. If you wanted to add your LinkedIn profile, that's great. Make sure that your LinkedIn profile adds value to the narratives that you're creating in the resume, right? It should sort of showcase the same types of themes that you're touching on the resume and maybe expand on those so people can get a better sense of who you are. If you do include your LinkedIn URL, just make sure you customize it first. If you haven't done that yet and you go to your LinkedIn URL, you'll see that there's a bunch of random numbers and letters after your name. You can go into your profile, edit it, and you'll see that there's an option to customize your URL, which will make it look nicer. Education section, many of you that's going to come first. I would often put the degree first, not the institution, right? So master's in X at University of Pennsylvania, PhD in X at University of Pennsylvania, and then an expected graduation date, not just a start date and to present, right? 2020 to present doesn't tell me that you're ready for a role or ready for a job or applying for an internship, but if you put the expected date, I have the information as the hiring manager that's out there. You don't really need a start date, for your undergrad or for your master's. You just need the graduation date if you have that already. Under that relevant experience section, where relevant experience is you as a student, you as a postdoc, you as an intern, you as a volunteer, you as a PBG member, all of that can live together under relevant experience if it's relevant to the role that you're applying to. Because in consulting, pretty much everything can be made relevant to consulting. So you as a graduate student will exist within that relevant experience section. You don't have to have an academic experience section and a professional experience. You can blend those all together because they're all relevant to the role that you're applying to in their different ways. What to look out for in terms of attention to detail. Headers, no one ever proofreads a header. Once you've written your header once, you'll never look at it again. You'll always look at the content. In Word, especially if you have an all caps header, there's a setting that says don't spell check all caps words unless you've selected, or who knows what's going on now in the current version, but that's always an option. And so you'll often see spelling mistakes in headers that never get picked up. And then other words that should be the right word, but you got the wrong word, assess and arses, they're very different words, discuss and discus. So keep an eye out for those just so that you're not making those types of mistakes. If you look at your version of your resume now, I would say a good 90% of you will have dates at some point that have different types of hyphens between them. Small ones with spaces, big ones, no spaces, some spaces, left space, right space. It doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really say anything about you. There's inconsistencies until someone needs to decide between 20 candidates, and you need to get it down to 4 candidates, right? And then you start looking as a hiring manager for arbitrary reasons to say no to someone. But this is sloppy formatting, so let's say no to that one, right? It's not because you've done anything wrong, your skills aren't valued, but they need to take X number of people and cut it down to a smaller number so that they can bring them on site for final round interviews. So again, just be consistent in terms of what that looks like. Because the one-page approach is often prioritizing consulting, people try to cram as much onto the page, and there's no margins, there's no white space, and it feels a little bit suffocating sometimes, right? It's a difference between a tree-lined alley and a sort of spring breeze blowing through the trees and a sort of an infested forest here with ticks all over it, right? You know which one you want to sort of walk through. It's the one on the right. So you can sort of make your resume sort of match that by having enough white space so that having read a section, people can process that, right? Because if everything's stacked on top of each other, there's no mental breaks as you're going through the resume. You want a few white spaces strategically there so that people can absorb the information that you're giving them. Formatting and prioritizing and bolding and doing all those types of things, I mean, there's many ways to do it, right? And I'm going to just talk about things that I see when I look at a lot of resumes. If we take this example here, there's sort of a lot going on, right? There's different types of formatting. There's bolding, there's italicized for the candidate, the university's bolded, Philadelphia's bolded. Philadelphia is not the most important part here. So we can sort of reorganize this slightly to put the emphasis on the things that are most important, right? So this is the same information. I got rid of the serifed font. So this is, non-serifed font. So it's easier to see when it's squished down because it isn't so fancy. I put the degree first and I bolded the degree and the institution. I unbolded the location. You don't need to give Philadelphia its own column. It's the least important part of it. The date's there, that's not bolded. And so the things I want people to notice here are my degree and my institution. That's why those are bolded, because I want people to see those clearly, right? So these are the types of thoughts that you can have. There's no right way or wrong way. The resume is a two-dimensional version of you, so you should be happy with what it looks like and how it gets across your brand.